initiative to protect people at risk of who were sleeping on the streets during the pandemic. And we'll hear from Lydia Stazen, who's director from the Institute of Global Homelessness. After our initial comments from the panel, we will take questions from you, the audience, so do put them in the chat, and also introduce yourselves to the chat to one another. But so I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Sir Michael Barber.
Greg, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to you and your colleagues for putting this session on. I think it'll be really significant, and I'm by far the least expert person on this panel. The true experts on homelessness are the rest of the panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say. My expertise is in how governments get things done, and that could be education reform or health reform or reducing crime or whatever, and or dealing with street homelessness and reducing it, and hopefully one day eliminating it altogether. So what I want to talk about is how I think about getting big, ambitious things done. As you know, I've just published a book called Accomplishment, How to Achieve Ambitious and Challenging Things. And what I've done in that book is set out the pattern of accomplishing really ambitious and challenging things. That applies to government programs, but also actually to works of art, great scientific discovery, success in elite sport and so on. So there's a pattern to accomplishment. And what I want to do in the few minutes I've got, prior to hearing from the true experts in this field, is just talk about that pattern of accomplishment and what the key features of it are. Because I think I hope and believe they will be very relevant to this topic. The first thing, needless to say, is to set an ambitious goal. And anybody can do easy things. So don't read my book if you want to do easy things. If you want to do ambitious, challenging things, it's for you. And there's nothing, or there's very few social problems more ambitious and more challenging than ending homelessness, ending street homelessness, as you call it. So that is absolutely fits the bill. How do you set goals, though, is a good question. Everybody knows that President Kennedy set a goal in 1961 to put a man, as they said in that, but a person on the moon by the end of the 1960s. What very few people know is, although he invested in that, the actual goal really only got sharpened in 1966, where Lyndon Johnson was making a speech at NASA, and he asked a lowly speechwriter in the White House called Bob Hardesty to write a speech, and Bob wrote the speech, and President Johnson didn't like it and sent it back and said, "There's no news in this, rewrite it." But by the time he'd rewritten it, it was the morning of he was rewriting it on the morning of the speech, which was at lunchtime. So he wanted to put some news in it. So he talked to a couple of people on the phone at NASA, and then he just wrote, instead of writing, "We will put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which was not news at all, he put the word first in. "We will put the first man on the moon." A few weeks earlier, the Russians had landed an unmanned spacecraft on the moon. And then he sent it off to the private office. He didn't consult any of the people, and he waited to see what would happen. He assumed that Johnson's advisors would just take out the word first because it was too risky. He knew they would. That's why it had never appeared up until 1966. But nobody was in. They were all busy. Johnson came back ready to do the speech, picked it up, loved this new commitment, made the speech. And within minutes, NASA was on the phone to Bob Hardesty, furious that this word first had appeared in the speech, and he thought he was going to be fired. But actually, Johnson ran into him in the White House and said, "Now, Bob, that's what I call a news lead," and threw his arms around him. So Bob survived. Why am I telling you this? Because actually, sometimes the experts know too much. So you get the data, you get the evidence, you get the expertise, and you look at it all and think, wow, that looks really difficult. You do need the data, you do need the expertise, you do need the advice and the wisdom that comes from experts, but sometimes ambition comes from making a judgment. So that's a thing to think about on this target. So that's point one, set an ambitious goal and take the evidence into account. My friend who runs the cycling team Sky and now Team Ineos, he says the data informs, it doesn't decide. In the end, you have to make a moral judgment. Ending street homelessness is a moral judgment. You're deciding you're going to end it, and we'll do what it takes to get it done. So the second question is decide what it would take. Forget about the constraints and all the limiting factors like government budgets and so on. What would it take to get this done? At this point, work out, kind of imagine how it might be done. Don't spend long on this because you can always get started anyway in the meantime. But so the first thing is set an ambitious goal. The second is imagine how you could get it done. Take the constraints off the table and think it through. Then thirdly, begin to plan. So, right, you want to do that now. How are you going to get it? So turn the theory, begin to plan at least how you're going to get started and how it gets started. Don't over plan, because lots of people spend so much time planning, they never get anything done. Remember Abraham Lincoln firing General McClellan at the beginning of the Civil War because he never actually did anything, he just planned things. So that's the third point. And then fourthly, you've got to think through now what this is going to be. So what actions are you going to take? What is the trajectory going to be from where you are now to achieving the goal? What shape will that curve have overall across the country, but also in particular places? And think through who are the actors on whom you will depend to get this done. I call that the delivery chain. Who are the people whose behavior you need to change to achieve your goal? Now you're getting serious about planning. And then once you've got a plan and you can get started, you need the data flowing in. And you're good at that. You're data-driven, evidence-informed people. But the data needs to flow in close to real time if you can, and review how it looks, not just across a whole country or across a whole city, but at local level, so you can benchmark and see, well, they're doing well there, not so well there. How do we know? How do we know what's working? But you also don't rely on the data. You need to get out and see for yourself, and talk to the homeless people on the streets, for example. I'm sure you all do that, so that you're triangulating the data with real perceptions of the front line. One problem that we solved for the Canadian government was getting clean drinking water to Indigenous Canadians, which you would think they might have done a century ago, but they're still only just achieving this year. But the reason they hadn't been able to solve it is that nobody from Ottawa ever went to an Indigenous community and said, what's the problem here? And they talked it through, and then when they understood it, they got it done. So there was nothing clever about that, but being in touch with the front line is important. It's been hard during the COVID times, but it's still really important. And then build routine reviews, so that on a routine basis, maybe monthly, maybe every second month, you're going to review how are we doing, what's working, what isn't working, what problems we have, how are we solving those problems. And when there is a problem, solve it. And you know, in your field, there are lots of other problems that homelessness is a symptom of. People leaving prison without knowing where they're going to be, people with big drug abuse problems, people who've been trafficked and then abandoned. All these things can affect it. So solving problems often means going back from the problem you see, street homelessness, to the source of the problem. But do it rapidly, do it quickly, get on the case. And that leads to my next and almost final point, which is you have to learn as you go. If you're doing an ambitious and challenging thing, by definition, you don't know enough at the beginning to solve the problem. You have to learn en route to the problem. And that means explicitly building into the processes you design ways of learning and then applying the learning back in. And sometimes you'll learn something, you'll apply it back in, it won't work. Then you learn some more and you keep at it until you get the problem solved. And then finally, it's about persisting. That none of these things are easy. Ambitious and challenging things are ambitious and challenging. Hard things are hard. As John F. Kennedy said, we don't choose to do these things because they're easy. We choose to do them because they're hard. These are hard things to do. So you have to stick at it, even when there are distractions, even when there are defeats, even when there are setbacks. And finally, remember that the reward for this is actually in accomplishing the goal. Don't bank on the acclamation or lots of people saying how marvelous you are. Just bank on getting the job done and feeling the moral joy of solving a huge social problem, which all of you are very committed to solving. So that's the pattern, and you see it played out again and again. Just give you one example. Galileo finally proved demonstrably with his telescope that the Earth moved around the sun, not the other way around. So he proved Copernicus right, which was his goal. He did that in 1612. for the next 30 years, not a single professor in a single European university believed Galileo was right, even though he proved it. My point is, just take satisfaction from getting the job done, not waiting for necessarily people to say how marvelous that is, because it might not happen.
Thank you so much, Sir Michael. Fascinating overview of how to get a big, ambitious goal and then get it done. The UK government has set such a goal. It said it would end street homelessness within the course of this Parliament, which will end at the latest by 2024. It hasn't yet defined what that would mean. And so our next speaker, Razan, who's president of Community Solutions, has looked into this in the US context and has come up with a definition which may be of great interest to policymakers here. So Razan.
Well, thank you so much for including me. And I think my remarks build very nicely on Sir Michael's. I lead Community Solutions, which is an NGO working across the United States to help now 89 communities who are very much the coalition of the willing to get to a functional end to homelessness. And indeed, this isn't simply aspirational and an urgent moral calling, but we see now that it's absolutely possible. We have 16 of our 89 communities have sustainably ended homelessness for one or more populations. And what the essence of this process has involved has been recognizing homelessness as a specific kind of problem, a complex, shifting dynamic problem that needs to be met with the kind of rigorous data tools, commitment to iterative learning, the commitment to a clear end state that Sir Michael described. And what we have found, and what I would suggest is the most powerful thing that Whitehall could do, is to create a clear and measurable definition of what ending rough sleeping looks like in objective terms, and then holding all stakeholders accountable to meeting that end state on a population basis, not program by program, but sharing the overall goal and resourcing the activities against the shared goal as opposed to program by program. And then in terms of Whitehall's role, clearing the path from a policy practice standpoint as barriers are surfaced in communities that are standing in the way of communities reaching that goal. And what I'd like to describe is how we in the States have defined this end state, and it's turning out to be meaningful in Australia and in Canada, where we are also coaching similar national efforts. And it's a state that we've come to define as functional zero, which means that essentially like a good public health system, that the problem is rare, it's quickly flagged when new incidents occur, like a good public health surveillance system, and it's quickly resolved and sustainably resolved. And that process involves new learning about what needs to be fixed and corrected so that that cycle of holding this problem in a state of equilibrium can be maintained. And functional zero we measure as basically, and there's only one way that we have seen can be successfully sort of resourced, through each community knowing by name in real time with a very high degree of certainty that everyone is accounted for, and that the quality of the data is high with respect to accuracy and can be regularly updated, at least on a monthly basis. And so this dynamic problem of rough sleeping must be met with a collective response, but organized in a way that is very heavily about knowing people by name and having all of the stakeholders working toward that common state of functional zero. We also, let me just pause and say, without presuming to know a great deal about the UK context, what we have found in the States is that this fundamentally shifts the way people work, and that in your context, it's really perhaps reinterpreting what government and NGO agents have perceived historically as a duty of care, as you know, to individuals, to really a kind of a duty of result to a population. And this, as Sir Michael indicated, this kind of constant iteration, shifting the, kind of the actions of, NGOs, government agencies to stay ahead of the problem rather than simply comply with, a program or an approach if in fact the problem is not actually being resolved. One of the things that we have found is especially critical with respect to having this comprehensive data that creates a shared picture of reality and accountability, allows testing of new ideas and a quick feedback loop. Well, it also allows communities, very importantly, to disaggregate their data by race. And at this moment where I think all of our attention has been and needs to continue to be focused on racial disparities in our systems, the quality of the data, whether it can be really understood to both the person level and in comprehensive terms, is vital for being able to deliver on our vision of racially equitable systems, not just powerful and effective systems. And so I'll just maybe close my remarks by reiterating the fact that we are seeing that homelessness is indeed a solvable problem if understood as the certain kind of problem that requires a collective, data-driven, highly accountable, and closely measured response. We, in addition to those communities that have already achieved functional zero for one or more populations and are now expanding this approach to eliminate homelessness on this by this definition for everyone, we have another 46 communities who are seeing measurable reductions, and they're the first few Canadian communities who reached this standard. We have several Australian communities that have also gotten to by name quality data for their whole populations of individuals. So it's very promising, and I hope can be a useful measure and a way of thinking about this issue as the UK takes on this vital and urgent and ambitious task.
Roseanne, thank you so much for your contribution. And we're now going to hear from the front line, as it were, of a community with very high levels of street homelessness, which is Greater Los Angeles. So Carter Hughley, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Greg, for having me. It's an honor to be here and in such esteemed company. I used to work in a different American city that Community Solutions supports, so I'm deeply appreciative of Roseanne's work. I think she's assembled an amazing team, and congratulations on the MacArthur Award, Roseanne. In a large city like Los Angeles, where, as Greg said, 73% of our homeless population is unsheltered, we don't have a great by name list the way that Roseanne was describing. Our data is more incomplete, and our data collection is more fragmented across multiple systems of record. So we've got major challenges tracking the progress toward larger goals. But there are a few things that we find helpful to facilitate a more joined up approach, especially as it relates to supporting those local organizations that are on the front lines. As everyone has said, the first step, we agree, is to unify efforts around a common strategy and common goals. I would say this is the major pain point in Los Angeles right now, which is why my team worked with over 150 local stakeholders and organizations to put together something called the LA Street Strategy, which makes it clear that the only way we will effectively respond to this humanitarian crisis is to stop pointing our fingers at, who's to blame for what we're seeing on our streets, and start aligning on those common sense strategies. Maybe I might disagree a little bit. I think we've got to set bold but achievable goals. I think the homeless system has a history of promising we're going to end homelessness and then not ending homelessness. And I think there's a fatigue that communities see when we don't deliver. So I think from our perspective, we need to be honest with the public about what we think we can achieve. And we've got to tackle those structural reforms, as Roseanne mentioned, that have really led to the racial disparities that we see. And if reimagined, can make a tangible impact on the quality of people's lives. So that's the first step. But I think the second thing is that a joined up approach doesn't just require those unified goals and strategies. It requires that integrated management and implementation. What does that delivery tent look like? Prior to the pandemic, Los Angeles had already created what I managed, the Home for Good Funders Collaborative. We had a unified homeless response center. We had something called Housing Central Command. And the whole point of all that infrastructure is to bake the coordination of resource allocation into the design of our homeless response and rehousing system. COVID-19 obviously demanded a rapid expansion of that type of integrated coordination as we decompressed our congregate shelters, we opened new medical sheltering sites, and we scaled up both testing and vaccinations. So moving forward, we're seeing more and more bold proposals to sort of learn the lessons from that whole of community approach and bake that integrated coordination into a sustainable governance and management model for Los Angeles that has an actual chance of ending this crisis within a reasonable time frame. The third thing I think for us, given our data challenges, is that we've got to rethink the defaults of how we're collecting our data in a largely unsheltered jurisdiction. You know, in a typical model, we send outreach teams to collect information from people who are rough sleepers. We silo that information within the homeless system. And in LA, we're starting to empower people who are experiencing a housing crisis to self-report their situation, to give us proactive feedback about what's going on for them, streamlining the application of for services and reducing the administrative burden to getting help. And we're leveraging the linked data that we have to help local organizations understand what are those key service intersections and potential points of intervention. For example, we're linking the mental health data with homeless outreach data to better understand like what are those predictors of adverse events like arrests, hospitalizations, and how can we combine all of the information from hundreds of healthcare partners to paint a unified picture of who's gotten access to the COVID-19 vaccine so that we can make it safer to bring people inside as we get further and further along in the pandemic. And finally, I would just say, you know, from the front lines of the work, I think the thing that I want to say to everyone is that we have to invest in the capacity of our local organizations to actually do this work at scale. You know, too often our local organizations are asked to get more results with the same staff at the same level of compensation and with the same benefits. And we know that responding to homelessness is one of the hardest jobs in the world. And we've got to start acknowledging it by raising compensation rates, introducing hiring and retention bonuses, paying down student loan debts, introducing wealth building opportunities for people who do this work, because we know that a lot of people arrive in this work because they have lived the life of knowing that they're one trauma away from homelessness. And so if we do that, if we reward their work and give them the training and tools they need to be effective, then I think we can also hold people accountable with results-driven contracting and things like that. But we've got to talk about creating the capacity of our local organizations to actually scale to the scale of the crisis that we're facing.
Carter, thank you so much for your contributions. There's some great discussion going on in the chat, so do keep that going. There's several references to the UK government's Everyone initiative, which was to get people off the streets during the pandemic. And this was assessed by our next speaker, Matt Wilkins from the National Audit Office. So Matt, over to you. Perhaps you can tell us what you found.
Great, thanks Greg. And thanks as well to CHI for inviting me. I've been keeping track of this conference throughout the week, and it seems like you've got a really sort of interesting, productive, and indeed global event going on. So congratulations for doing that. And so Michael at the beginning said he was probably the least qualified member. I think I'm definitely up there as being somebody who just throughout the pandemic has sat here and asked people about what they've done. So rather than being somebody like most participants who've actually got out there and done something to tackle homelessness. So thanks to all of those of you who do that. I think it's a real accomplishment. Greg, as you said, I work for the UK National Audit Office. For those of you who aren't aware of us, we are the nation's spending watchdog. We are entirely independent of government. We're a parliamentary body. We audit the accounts of everything that government does. And on the other side of the house where I work, we produce around 60, 65 reports each year, looking at the value for money of government activity. We've probably been one of the most sort of present commentators there's been in UK public life in recent years, in the last year rather, on COVID. And we produced around 20 pieces of work on the government's response to the pandemic. One of which was one that I wrote recently, published in January, on how government tackled the rehousing of rough sleepers during the early stages of basically March through May of 2020 under the Everyone In initiative. I just want to say a couple of words about what we found, the key learnings from that report, and then turn to, I think, what that means for tackling the target in the longer term. I think the key thing for our report is, obviously, I'm a professional cynic. It's my job to be quite critical of government activity. But one of the things we flagged in this report, unlike with other aspects of government response to the coronavirus pandemic, was the accomplishment. Actually, government working in partnership with local authorities, the voluntary sector, very swiftly did something which can be regarded as a real achievement. I think that's not an easy thing for us to say, actually. So we do congratulate colleagues for that. I think it's worth bearing in mind that although this is, of course, around homelessness and rough sleeping, the initial sort of impetus for this came from a public health angle. So you had a hugely vulnerable population who were at risk of really being very affected by early transmission. And I think in that, in particular, the Everyone In initiative can be seen as an achievement. I mean, I think the initial sort of analysis we've seen published in the Lancet, for example, found that up to 20,000 transmissions were avoided. The number of people sleeping rough who died of the pandemic was very low. I saw figures that it was under 20, for example. I mean, these are early stages of analysis. But we did see that what was achieved very early on from a public health angle was very important. And also turning to sort of tackling homelessness itself, the last data we saw, almost 40,000 people were brought in, rehoused. A lot of those have then been placed into longer term accommodation. And one of the things that we did with our report was we went and spoke to various local authorities who've been working with rough sleepers for a number of years and found that for the first time, this gave them the opportunity to place people who had long histories of street homelessness into settled accommodation. So in those two key aspects, I think the Everyone In initiative can be regarded as an achievement. I think there are two key pieces of learning to take from that. One is that, yes, government achieved it. However, one could potentially argue somewhat provocatively that it did so by acting in a way not common to how government usually works. If we look at the way that CLG, the department responsible for this, acted, you saw a deliberate sort of restructuring in the absence of a contingency program, use of very strong local information, which is a very interesting subject I'm keen to hear about, to target in a very granular fashion particular populations to work very, very quickly. This was a way that government wouldn't necessarily ordinarily work in this space. And working upwards, you had Dame Louise Casey, Baroness Casey came in, took a lot of responsibility here. Ordinary sort of lines of responsibility within government were removed as well. So it's a very fast response. I think there's a learning for government to think about what that means as it goes forward. I think another key part of learning is that actually we had for the first time a public acknowledgement of the potential scale of the rough sleeping population. I've seen in the chat people referring to the snapshot. I think we're under 3,000 now. It was 4,266 before the pandemic struck. Don't forget that that is a figure which is done on an annual basis. And so it's fine for certain trend bits, but it doesn't give you a real sense of the scale. I know that there are all caveats around the information. I think what's really interesting is for the first time in England, we saw this is the number of people who could be at risk of sleeping rough. I think that's a really useful thing to build upon. So that's what we can learn from the government's response to the pandemic. To turn to the target they have, I think it's really great that the panel has flagged that to end homelessness is, this is by 2024. That is fewer than 3 years away. So on the one hand, you have a far greater acknowledgement of scale. On the other, you have a target, which in government terms is not long away to do. I think that there is also an issue, as others have flagged, about definitions. What do we actually mean by ending homelessness? Now, actually, you could take rapid action theoretically and sweep certain cohorts into certain places. But is that the same as having a long-term solution to the issues which are driving people to sleep on the streets? I think really being clear about the time frame and what it is that you mean by it are two sort of building blocks that you need to set out pretty immediately. Beyond that, I think we're asked for three key things that we'd like to see government turn to achieve its targets. Number one for us is a strategy. I know that sounds very sort of nerdy and something that comes from accountants, but we want to see a plan for, it's very interesting what Michael was saying at the beginning, but what are you going to achieve when? Who's responsible? So homelessness, actually, although it's a responsibility within government with CLG. The driving forces of homelessness sit with other parts of the department. Who's in charge here? Who's driving things? This is something that we pushed for, the Committee of Public Accounts have pushed for, both in homelessness in 2017 and rough sleeping more recently. And we've yet to see one of those as far as them were published. The second thing we like to see is full transparency. I mentioned the snapshots, I mentioned the information which came out about rehousing rough sleepers. We see no reason not to have published data on a monthly basis about the number of people sleeping rough, monitoring of that over time. There is, the systems are in place. Data collected in England is in a better shape than it was a few years ago because of things like H-Click. But we see no reason not to have that made publicly available. And thirdly, around funding, it wouldn't be for me to push on a change in funding, but what we would like to see is greater certainty and alignment. So we have lots and lots of pots of money coming at sort of sporadic intervals, but actually to plan out proper homelessness services, as people be aware, can take a few years, rather than producing things which are in and out and have to be rebid for the small pots of money on a sort of irregular basis. To sort of summarize, I think what we saw with everyone in was really government demonstrated what is possible in a sort of very rapid situation. And we think the learning from that could be usefully taken forward to address hitting its 2024 target. Thank you.
Matt, thank you so much for your insight there and your comments. So I'm delighted to say our last speaker is Lydia Stazen, Director of the Institute for Global Homelessness.
Good morning. Well, it's morning for me. I think it's afternoon for many of you, so I'll just say good day. It's great to be with you all and talking about the importance of kind of a strong, centralized government response to homelessness. I always actually really prefer to go last because I can weave together all the different threads that the different presenters have so eloquently shared today. So we know globally there's really only a handful of countries that have national strategies on homelessness. There's about 25 countries out of 193 that have a national strategy. And that was actually lower than I thought when I was preparing for this conversation. Some of the similar themes that we see in those strategies are ones that we've talked about today. Setting a definition for homelessness, setting some parameters around measurement or data collection. I thought it was interesting that Matt was the only one who kind of touched on the resource allocation, and that's a really important function of these national strategies too, to bring the pots of money forward to align and actually make some progress on those targets. The other thing that I think is important in these national strategies that we sometimes see is setting the priority populations. So as Roseanne mentioned, the United States national strategy puts a priority on veterans, families, youth ages 18 to 24 who are homeless, and then those who are chronically homeless, which is another definition that describes a certain type of homelessness. And so setting those priorities and giving communities the parameters by which they can then set their local or regional specific plans that are maybe more adapted to their particular circumstances. So out of the countries where IGH works, we work in about 10 countries, only 4 of those have national strategies. So Chile and Uruguay in South America both have national strategies to end homelessness, as well as the United States and Canada. So I thought it might be helpful for me to just highlight a couple of things that I thought were interesting from these 4 national strategies. So in the Canadian national strategy, one thing that I think is very notable is that they recognize the importance of serving the Indigenous people. And the Indigenous people in Canada have come up with their own definition of homelessness that recognizes the colonization and the loss of land, the loss of their land that contributes to their understanding of homelessness. And so that plan recognizes and incorporates that into their national strategy, which I think is a very important acknowledgement and helps to address some of the racial disparities that we see in the data there. So that's an important component to think about. The national strategy in Chile is called Barrios Calle Cero, so basically Street Zero, and they have really established a focus on street homelessness. So looking at that particular population as being the most in need. And sometimes it's really hard to talk about priority populations because we know that everyone needs and deserves a home and has a right to a home. But when you're working in an extremely resource constrained environment like they have there in Chile, sometimes unfortunately you do have to make those decisions. And so that is what they have focused on there in Chile, is the street homelessness. The other thing that they had in their strategy, which is not common across all the other national strategies, is to set aside some funding and a focus on evaluating. So are their programs to address street homelessness actually being effective? So I think it goes a little bit beyond just the data collection. Here's the number of people we have on the street, and goes to evaluating some of the programs and interventions that they've put into place also. Uruguay also has a national strategy, as I mentioned, and it also focuses on street homelessness. And another thing that is, I think, interesting about their strategy is that it calls for an alignment with the healthcare sector, and it calls for an alignment with the youth sector, so sort of the foster care or kids in care sectors, to make sure that, you know, I think it's an understanding and a recognition that homelessness does not happen in a vacuum, that there are these other pieces, you know, just of life and of society that really impact or drive homelessness and can be real partners at the table in helping to solve or address it. So, and then finally, you know, the United States also has a national strategy to end homelessness. I think it has expired. I think it needs updated. As I mentioned, they've set some particular priority populations. They have, you know, set some parameters by which local communities can guide their work. The other thing that I think is unique about the national plans and strategies historically in the United States is that they do require every community in the United States to feed data into what's called the Homeless Management Information System. So it's essentially in some sense, a shared database across the United States. And, you know, while all the communities have various levels of data quality, we have kind of a structure or a framework by which to think about data and can make some progress there. So again, that's just a real quick kind of overview of some of the national strategies that we're aware of. But again, you know, we really believe in the importance of that coordinated action, that central government response to just get everyone pushing in the right direction. So hopefully that was of interest.
Lydia, thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists for those excellent observations. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to members of the panel now. So Michael, first with you, I mentioned at the outset that your review of the effectiveness of delivery of government policies and projects. There's a question in the chat that points out that many of the drivers behind rough sleeping, which cover the criminal justice system, the care system, mental health, sit with other government departments, not just with MHCLG. So can you tell us anything about your emerging thinking on your review about how the government should tackle cross-cutting problems like ending street homelessness? I think you're muted.
So thank you very much for the question. It's a really good question. One of the things that's been really striking about the 6 months I've spent working for the Boris Johnson government compared to my time working for the Blair administration is how over those 20 years, and this is not to do with the individual politicians or party politics at all, it's that the problems governments are working on around the world now are nearly all cross-cutting. So if you take Boris Johnson's agenda, the things at the top of his agenda is jobs and skills, net zero, levelling up that you mentioned yourself, Greg, and recovering lost ground in the public services. Not one of those fits neatly into one department. Whereas when I was working for Tony Blair, we did health waiting times in health departments, school test results in schools, crime in the Home Office, and so on. So that's changed, and the work I've done for the Trudeau government, the same. You can see the same trend. The work I've done in Australian governments, you can see the same trends. So nearly all major government priorities are cross-cutting now, and that's why having a strong central delivery function is good. So Boris Johnson now has, as a result of the work I've been doing with him and his team, a number 10 delivery unit. It's got a leader who's starting to lead it. In time, it will be led by a woman called Emily Lawson, who's currently running the brilliant vaccine rollout here in the UK. So that's all set up, and everything they're doing is cross-cutting, and they use the power of the Prime Minister's office to pull together people behind a goal. And I think that's what's going to happen, not necessarily through the number 10 delivery unit, because at the moment, homelessness hasn't yet become part of its agenda. But whoever's doing that, somebody at the center has got to pull the threads together and build a strategy around it. So it's not just that. So the MHCLG department would need the weight of the center of government behind it to get people coordinated to deliver this outcome.
And do you think, just to follow that up, Michael, is there a prospect that homelessness, and particularly ending street homelessness, rough sleeping as the government calls it, could become more central to this cross-cutting agenda? Because things like levelling up do cut across that.
I think there's a lot to play for. That there's active work going on levelling up, more on getting the policy right, what it means in practice, what you'd have to achieve by 2024, and then later on to demonstrate that you really were levelling up. And I think you are the right kind of people to be in dialogue with MHCLG, which is one of the most significant, if not the most significant department in the levelling up agenda anyway, for you to be in dialogue with them about how this will fit into the levelling up agenda. So I don't want to, it's not my job to commit government to anything, but I do think there's lots to play for there, and MHCLG is right plugged in, and indeed in some ways leading the way on levelling up at the moment. So you should be in dialogue with them.
Thank you very much. Matt, I'd just like to ask broadly the same question to you, given that ending street homelessness by 2024 is a cross-government challenge. Do you think the government is set up correctly to deliver on this?
Oh, so whether or not government itself is set up correctly, that's probably not a question for us. But you're absolutely right, Michael, Greg. The problems that are driving people to be on the streets are not entirely within the bailiwick of one single government department, but it's the government department which has the responsibility for tackling it. I'm thinking, I mentioned in my presentation, DWP, Universal Credit, that they need to be brought to the table. Treasury are behind them as well. Not just them, not just national government, all the different players who can provide solutions, local authorities, and also voluntary sector housing associations. So you cannot tackle it without having, in my view, this is a personal view based on what we've seen, everyone there who's needed to be brought in and to be driving it forward with responsibilities allocated as well. I think it's too complicated to fit within one government department.
Thank you, Matt. One more question for you, Michael, and then I'll put the same question to Roseanne. She and Matt both talked about having a definition to define what the government means about a pledge to end street homelessness, and then to measure progress towards it. What are your thoughts on that? And is this, given that it was a commitment in the Conservative manifesto in December 2019, should that be a task for government alone, or would they strengthen their position if they brought in an organisation, I suppose, like ours, or asked more widely how they should define a task like ending street homelessness?
Well, the first thing to say, Greg, on that question is I'm always in favour of, whenever I work with governments, if you're going to have some big, bold aspiration, you have to define what would count as success in delivering that aspiration. So I totally agree with Roseanne that you need a definition. Actually, as I said in the chat, I thought the functional zero definition was really strong. So I do think, whether it's this issue or any other issue, if you're a government and you set an ambitious goal, you've got to define what the goal is. You've got to be able to measure progress towards it. You've got to see whether you're on track or not on track. And if you're off track, you've got to do something about it. It's at one level common sense, but it's actually quite rare for governments to do it in a really systematic way. I do think the Johnson administration here is now set up much better to get these things done. The other thing I wanted to comment on, if I may, while I've got a moment, is I agree with the points that have been made about funding. You don't want 16 separately funded programs all touching on the problem. I did some work for the Louisiana school system, and one of the things we did was it was about 14 or 15 different programs for helping young people graduate from high school. and we combined them into one big pot, and all the 16 people who'd been leading the different programs now became responsible for reducing dropout rates in a number of high schools. And so you had a unified budget and a serious goal. So I think that needs thinking through. The other thing I'd say is you want to start with the goal as you did in this question, Greg, and come up with a plan, and others have talked about this. The money is the end of the argument. I think it's really convincing to go to the Treasury and say, this is the goal we have, this is how we do it, this is the story we're going to tell, and this is the money we need. And if you can't get all of the money, get the money to get started.
Just before I go to Roseanne, Michael, who should own that definition? Should it be government alone, or should they involve others?
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, well, I think if you're going to hold a government minister or a government to account for a manifesto commitment, I mean, if a manifesto commitment is a serious thing to do, so the government should definitely set out to achieve the manifesto commitment. But of course, they should be in dialogue with all of you, and they might want to build capacity in the NGO world to deliver it. But I think the goal, particularly if it's a manifesto commitment, does need to be owned by government, and they need to be held to account for delivering on what they committed to.
Thank you. Roseanne, could I ask you more about the importance of defining a target? Sorry, you're muted, I think, Roseanne.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you.
A little bit of
Hello, Roseanne.
yes, can you hear me now?
You've got a bit of an echo. While we sort that out, I'll go to other members of the panel with a different question. We have a question that's been posted by Jan Sheldon, and I'm going to put this to you, Carter, and then I'll ask Lydia. With a task such as ending homelessness, there are a lot of other players other than government involved. We have the voluntary sector, for example, in your case. How important is it to involve the voluntary sector in a task like ending rough sleeping, ending street homelessness? Carter, you first, if I may.
Hugely important. I think one of the challenges is that in the United States, the national government has over-relied on our voluntary sector to do the things that we can't do with the resources that the nonprofit sector has. I think one of the things that we've seen really be successful is to combine the coalition building work that a lot of our philanthropic organizations, nonprofit organizations do with policy expertise and communication savvy. So for example, my team, Home for Good, we work alongside our public and private funders to really understand what are the challenges and opportunities, and then we leverage our community organizing and communications experts to mobilize the public around a strategic agenda. For example, we've worked really hard to divest resources from policing and invest those resources into affordable housing, alternatives to incarceration, and in the services and supports that people need. And we wouldn't be able to do that without the voluntary sector and the community organizing groups that we work with. I also think they're critical in narrative shifting. We cannot continue to let the crisis of homelessness be framed by those with no interest in understanding or solving it, because this is not the fault of individuals. It is a collective failure to imagine and build better systems that empower people. And we have to speak to root causes and system failures that must be changed. And there's no one better to speak to those than those who are on the front lines of this work, who are seeing the results of those system failures. And we need a national strategy that is resourced to implement at scale that the voluntary sector will never be able to surmount. And so I think they're critical. They're really critical in shifting the narrative and telling truth to power about what's necessary to really move people from a crisis into housing and stability. But what I want is that the national government here in the United States stops over relying on the voluntary sector when what we're missing is the resources at scale to make big change happen.
Thank you. Before we go to Lydia, Roseanne, should we go back to you? It looks like your computer's working. We were asking you about the importance of a definition, and you've broken down the definitions, I think, into community level targets as well as a national, a bigger target.
Right. It really is for any large goal, and as any urgent goal as is this one, to ask people to run a race without telling them what the finish line is you're setting up a failed situation. And the definition of functional zero we actually arrived at with just significant work over many years with communities. And you'll also find, and I think what has been significant to it holding this idea of a dynamic measure for a dynamic problem, is it's the way we solve other complex problems. It's the way you would look at any kind of public health challenge, for instance. Like we, for instance, haven't eliminated COVID, but we can understand, what its individual and its collective patterns are, how they move and change. Policy is responsive to that set of measures. And homelessness, the evidence thus far is, if we think of it in similar terms, not simply as a public health issue, but as an issue that is responsive to these kind of dynamic public health measures, that has been now borne out in several countries, not just our own, with respect to how you organize activity at a population level, how you work toward an end state, which is basically an end state of equilibrium. The work of ending homelessness will continue to evolve. But I think, and Carter mentioned this, to even shift the narrative and be credible in saying and offering proof that this is a solvable problem, we have to redefine the end state as one that is dynamic. Ending the problem means knowing how to stay ahead of it and making it rare, making it exceptional, making it brief and solidly resolved when it happens, and not to be thinking that zero is we never see the problem, but zero is we have a system that actually prevents this problem from growing, from impacting vulnerable people, and that our public expectations are around an end state of constant problem solving.
Thank you, Lydia. I want to come to you with the point earlier about the role of the voluntary sector. And if you're looking at, as you do, at national governments and their records in working to end homelessness, what about these other players that not just include the voluntary sector, but in the chat someone's pointed out that business has a role in terms of housing. And we also in the UK have a big role for local authorities, and I'm sure in the US it's mayors and other municipal authorities.
Well, as Carter was saying, homelessness is a failure of multiple systems. And so it's going to take players from all of those systems at the table to create solutions that actually work. I think one thing we haven't raised here yet is the importance of having people with lived experience of homelessness at the table with equal voice, with equal power to help create those solutions and to bring their experience into the discussion and into the planning process and into the implementation process. I think another term that we hear sometimes in terms of the voluntary sector is that they're the street level bureaucrats, right? They're the ones who are responsible for putting these policies and these programs into play. And maybe they have a lot of discretion in how to do that. But I think in many situations, we don't see a feedback loop from what's actually happening on the ground back up into those policies. And so most countries need to do a better job of creating those links from what's happening on the ground up to the policies and adapting based off of that.
Thank you, Lydia. Very good point about the importance of the voices and the insights of people with lived experience of homelessness, which I think goes back to Sir Michael's point at the beginning of going to talk to people who the policy is most going to impact. I'd like to ask Matt and then Sir Michael about the role of local authorities in delivering a national pledge like ending street homelessness. I imagine there's some concern in government that the government's reputation is on the line, where the delivery partners at the front line are going to be local authorities. What do you think governments can do to encourage delivery by local authorities on a target such as ending street homelessness? Perhaps I can ask Matt and then Sir Michael.
Yeah, I think obviously local authorities are those in the UK system with the ultimate statutory responsibility under legislation, so they're integral. I I think what's also key is that they're the ones with the knowledge. So in many cases, these are the ones who are delivering the services in partnership with others. So as the actual provider of services, are absolutely crucial. I think what we need to get correct, the relationship between national and local, is around accountability and information. So what we have seen in recent years in the UK is better information flows. So you do have that with which national can hold local to account for delivery. I think there's also, this is where you need somebody else such as ourselves to be able to, again, on the information, it needs to be out there, it needs to be made public and transparent. So we can then hold national government as well to account for it. So I see a sort of chain of accountability going down to the delivery as well. So the national government is responsible for holding people to account, working with them, and we are also responsible for holding the national to account for its targets.
Thank you. So Michael, what do you think of that? And is there a case for local targets?
Yeah, I think there is. Well, first of all, in anything like this, if you've got a national target, I would say, well, you've got to work out your delivery chain. I mentioned it earlier. So between the homeless person on the street and the minister responsible in Whitehall, what are all the links in the chain to make sure that you can end homelessness? And local authorities, exactly as Matt says, will be fundamentally important in this. So you do need to get them on board. And it would be a good idea if each of them had their own target that all mapped up together to make the national target. They might want to be even more ambitious. You and I first interacted when I was doing the national literacy program in primary schools 20 odd years ago. Every single local authority had a target for literacy that added up, made the national target. And the crucial thing was to help them feel the pressure of a target, yes, but also give them the resource and capacity to do what they needed to do to deliver the target. And I think the same is true here. And the other thing I'd say is, you inevitably in democratic countries, when you have central and local government in relationship with each other, the party politics can play a part. If you've got a conservative government, how will they get on with local authorities controlled by other parties? And I think what you need to do, especially on something like this, is a classic case, is build a moral purpose, sort of inspire people with the moral purpose, which cuts far across any party commitment. And in that case, at that point, it is partly a technical delivery issue, but it's also a movement for change. And you've got to get the two things working together.
I'd love to go on with this conversation, but I'm afraid we're coming out of time. But that's a great note on which to end. Building a movement to change is very much part of our vision. And I think many people watching as well today. Thank you so much to our audience for watching. Thank you so much to our magnificent panel for their insights from this country, but also from the United States and indeed globally. Our final session today in Impact 2021 is at 4 o'clock, when our discussion will be on what works to prevent homelessness. And our speakers there include Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who's Professor of Housing and Social Policy at Heriot-Watt University, and Sue Coulson, who's Chief Executive of Capital Letters. So thank you again for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.